On the developmental processes, periods, and issues, there are three key processes that developmental psychologists looked at: the biological, the cognitive, and the social emotional. And they look at the interplay and exchange between all three of these. For the biological, these are changes in an individual's physical nature. So this is going to be height, weight, motor skills. So that's biological. For the cognitive, we're talking about changes in an individual's thoughts, intelligence, and language. That's another thing we'll talk about. Example, 2-word sentences, solving a puzzle. Those things are going to be cognitive in nature. Social emotional development is in regards to your relationships with other people. It's going to be also related to emotions and personality. So the biological, the cognitive, the social emotional, processes all interact with each other and they influence each other. As an example of this, a child smiling in response to a parent's touch. That includes all three of them. So there's the biological, you touch the child's face, you touch them. Cognitively, they understand that you touched them with intention, that you meant to touch them, and then they do the social emotional thing, which is to smile in response to your touch. It's an interplay, it's a going back and forth, and it's those three processes together is what a lot of developmental psychologists will look at. The connections between those three are being explored in two different emerging research fields: developmental cognitive neuroscience and developmental social neuroscience. So cognitive is looking at the links between development, cognitive processes in the brain, and developmental neuroscience examines the connections between development and the social emotional processes in the brain. And so why we go through this course, if you I really like the developmental cognitive neuroscience, that might be something you could look at maybe for grad school, or the social emotional, whatever you're interested in. And so here's a figure that kind of goes a little bit more, that gives you a visual for what we're talking about here, how the biological, the cognitive, and social emotional all interact with each other. That's the developmental processes. Again, we'll talk about all of these things more in depth throughout the course. For the periods, these are the periods that we're going to look at in child psychology: prenatal, infancy, early childhood, middle and late, and adolescence. Just briefly, prenatal, this is going to be from conception to birth, roughly 9 months. Infancy is from birth to about 18 to 24 months. Early childhood is from the end of infancy to about 5 or 6. So this is also called the preschool years. In early childhood, they become more self-sufficient. They get ready to go to school. They're playing with their peers for numerous hours a day. Middle and late childhood, this is going to be from about 6 to 11. This is the elementary school years. And then adolescence, which is going to be the transition from childhood to early adulthood. It's going to be from about 10 to 12 to about 18 or so. And again, I think I mentioned this in the last video, the idea that today developmental psychologists do not believe that change ends with adolescence. You do not become the person that you're going to be at 18, and that's the person you are through your entire life. You develop and you change all the way up until your death. Development is a lifelong process, essentially. In addition to the developmental periods, you have to consider the time and the history of when someone grows up, which leads us into what they call cohort effects. A cohort is a group of people born in a similar point in history who share similar experiences as a result. So some examples from the book: people who grew up during the Great Depression or World War II, they have like a unifying world view that links them all together. So the cohort effects person's time, the time of their birth, their era, their generation, but not their actual age. Example, millennials are the generation born after 1980, and they are characterized in particular by a couple of things the book lists: ethnic diversity and their connection to technology. So millennials have always been connected to some type of device or computer. And that is going to change their developmental process, the idea that they're always connected compared to generations before who were not. And it could be positive, or there could be some negative ramifications from that. The last part in this section is issues in development. So one of the examples here is nature versus nurture, whether development is primarily influenced by nature or by nurture. Essentially the biological inheritance, the genes, or the environmental experiences. Linking back to the beginning of the chapter, Kaczynski is brought up here again. Was it his genes that made him a killer, or was it his environment? Was it the things that happened to him throughout his lifespan? For example, when he was young, he became very, very sick and he had to be put into isolation, and he could not be touched. And his mother actually thought that it somehow broke him. This idea of isolation and not being touched as an infant it somehow affected him and he just did not quite develop right, was her opinion. Was she right? Maybe, maybe not. Another issue, I forgot to list it on this slide, but another issue in developmental psych is continuity versus discontinuity. Basically, is development, is it gradual? Is it something that happens over a long period of time? Or is it in these distinct stages where you change basically all of a sudden? And one of the examples from the book here to try to give you an idea of what they're talking about here is the idea of an oak tree, that it's a seed and it grows up to become a giant oak tree. That's a very long and gradual process compared to a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. That's almost like an immediate transformation there. And so that's the difference between, is it gradual development or does it go through these very distinct stages? And then the last issue in developmental psychology is early versus later experience issue. The degree which early experiences, especially in infancy or later experiences, are key for determinants of children's development. So think of another way to say this: early experiences versus late experiences, which are more influential on the person's development. And for a lot of people in this culture, we have kind of this ingrained belief that early experiences are going to shape us and somehow mold us, and we won't be able to escape that developmental path that we're put on. One of the reasons for this is Freud. His ideas about childhood and how they affected development is something that's left an indelible mark on our field in this culture. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. So these are issues that are in development. The nature-nurture, the continuity, and the early versus late. What developmental psychologists say about all three of these arguments is they recognize that it is unwise to take an extreme position on any of these. So you don't want to say it's all nature. You don't want to say it's all nurture. You kind of want to be somewhere in the middle. Now you might lean one way or another, but again, it's probably unwise to just say it's one or the other in any one of those three arguments. They all play a part throughout the lifespan. It's still a spirited debate, but most people now are more kind of in the middle than at the extremes. All right, in the next set of slides, we'll discuss the science of child development.